Hello, everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome once more to another one of ResPublica's online events. And we are nothing if not fashionable, because in the midst of food insecurity, crises in world trade and governance, we are inaugurating another part of our panel discussion on the type of trade deals the UK should strike. And we've got a wonderful, wonderful panel, which I'm really, really thrilled to host. We have George Eustice, MP, former Secretary of State for the Environment, fast becoming a Red Tory hero, not least which was his stinging and cogent criticism of the UK trade deals signed recently with Australia and New Zealand. And we would want him to recapitulate some of that. We're also honoured and very grateful to Daniel Zeichner MP for joining us, who's the Shadow Minister of Food, Farming and Fisheries. And Daniel, welcome, wonderful to have you. And we also look for Labour's critique of these trade deals and also what you would like to see in the future in such agreements. We also have, and forgive me for having a council of experts, but there we are, that is what we have. We have David Bowles from the RSPCA, with whom ResPublica has worked very productively, particularly in light of our recent report, which my colleague has posted on UK trade policy and animal welfare. And we have Nick von Westenholz from the NFU, who's another great specialist in UK trade deals, particularly from the food and farming industry. Okay, to sum up, something's gone rather wrong. We are, I think, ideologically, in the Conservative Party at least, the idea was that free trade would raise all boats and would be to the advantages of everybody. And I think it's certainly true that under the Liz Truss wing of the Conservative Party, this kind of extreme liberal economic view was believed, sincerely believed, and upheld, that essentially throwing down all barriers and tariffs would somehow benefit us all. And part of what we're going to discuss in this event is, I think, reasonably why that view is incorrect, in what manner it's incorrect, and what path it's put the country on, and at what cost. This event is building on a report that we did with the NFU and the RSPCA, which my colleague has posted on the side, on UK trade policy and animal welfare. And in that report, we argued that the approach that was clearly evident from Truss's time at trade that was coming risked essentially Britain undermining its own commitment to high farm standards and high animal welfare standards by allowing mass importation of food and goods that didn't meet those standards, that we essentially marginalized our own high quality production. And instead of exporting quality, we were diminishing it at home and not advocating it abroad. Well, this and many other problems have been rightly identified by George Eustice in a masterly speech. So I'd ask him to speak to that agenda, to talk to what's wrong in our deals, and perhaps most importantly, talk about the sort of deals we should be writing that combine the best elements of a free trade policy with advancing the standards and outcomes that we as a nation want. So George, welcome. Over to you, sir.
Well, thanks very much, Philip. And I think the first thing to say from my point of view is a modern trade deal should be about more than just commerce and an exchange of opportunities for trade. It is an opportunity, particularly for the UK, to be able to promote its soft power and to agitate and argue for improvements, particularly in animal welfare, but also environmental outcomes, and to use some of the leverage that we have in those trade agreements to try to drive up standards, around the world. Now, some people might think that sounds unrealistic, but the truth is that measured by import value, the UK food market is the third largest in the world, third only to China and Japan. And that is because we have a large, quite sophisticated market, but also because, of course, we do import quite a lot of product. And the United States produces more food than it consumes as a net exporter. The same is true, I think, of France and Germany, and many other countries actually produce most of the food that they need and also export some. So it puts us in a powerful position because everybody wants access to the UK market. And then we're able to basically set the terms of that access. And I think that, my critique, if you like, of the trade agreements that were done, particularly with Australia, were that there was an ideological problem getting in the way. That there are people in my party who believe very passionately and ideologically that free trade is a good thing in and of itself. And they believe that you should unilaterally disarm, as it were, and unilaterally give access to your market without necessarily securing anything in return. And this stems from a sort of economist's view that it's always better to just get rid of tariffs rather than actually use them to get an exchange of opportunities. And I think what was missing was that sort of hard-headed realism that it's a tough world out there, that other countries might feign support for liberalization, but will ferociously defend their own interests and always seek access without granting much in return. And we needed to be harder-headed about the way we approached the Australia agreement in particular, since they didn't have a great deal to offer, but they wanted access to our market. And we should have been willing to name the price of that access and actually to limit the scale of the access. And I wanted to focus a bit on animal welfare, because I think this is a key area. And it is sometimes said that it's not possible due to WTO rules to recognize animal welfare in trade agreements. And the first thing is that's not entirely true, because there are elements that have been approved by the WTO, such as a ban on the sale of seal fur, for instance, and others besides, that do mean there are cases where you can recognize animal welfare. Just a couple of years ago, the United States passed a law to ban the import of fish from countries that didn't change their laws to bring them into line with US law when it came to seals and other marine mammals. And the UK actually therefore changed its legislation to bow to that US demand. And it's also the case that even within the United States, there's been a lot of debate over the last couple of years over something called Proposition 12, which was effectively a new restriction brought in by the state of California to say that pig and poultry production everywhere in the United States had to conform with Californian standards on animal welfare in order to be able to be sold in California. Now, this has been quite contentious. It's before the Supreme Court now, and the judgment's delayed. But it does beg the question that if it's okay for California to set down a method of production standards, why can't a sovereign nation like the UK do the same? However, of course, we took legal advice on this, and it is the case that the way the WTO procedures and rules are drafted are outdated. Most of this stems back, to the 1970s under the sort of GATT agreements and various versions that came after that. And it is generally assumed that you cannot put an absolute ban in place on the import of products based on animal welfare alone. And DEFRA wrestled quite a bit with this, particularly in the context of a US trade agreement. And the reason this is so problematic with a US trade agreement is that the United States effectively has no federal level laws on on-farm animal welfare. They have, a few laws on slaughter, but they're not very good, to be honest. And chickens often don't get covered by that. But most of the on-farm regulation is covered at state level. And with the exception of California, most states have virtually no animal welfare standards at all. Now, this causes a conundrum for the UK. How do you deal with a country that has a sort of ideological aversion to animal welfare regulation and standards at all? And so what we came up with was quite a novel idea, which was to use tariffs as a means of differentiating between individual producers. And we had a policy called the banded tariffs policy. And what that meant is that you would accredit individual producers in the US that could demonstrate that they met equivalent standards to the United Kingdom and grant them preferential tariff access, while the lower standard producers who could not meet our standard would still face a very high tariff barrier and would in effect be excluded from the UK market. And this was entirely lawful under Section 24 of GATT. And there was legal advice to that effect. Some people would say it's quite difficult to implement that, but we already have a very similar system through the old EU cattle accreditation service, which basically accredits US producers and Australian producers as being hormone free for the purposes of being able to send beef both to the UK and the European Union. And USDA run that scheme in the United States, and they accredit individual cattle producers and are subject to surveillance by both the UK and the European Union to check that they're doing that job properly. So there is a precedent for that, and you could extend it to cover many of these other areas. And actually, DEFRA had done extensive work, to value what that differential would be. So what is the differential between a cage system of poultry versus the systems that we have here? What is the regulatory financial advantage that gives to the lower standard producer? And then what tariff do you need to have in place to mitigate that unfair advantage that's paid for through the misery of animals, for want of a better way of putting it? And I think it's a very powerful policy. I think it remains technically government policy, but they've yet to actually properly articulate it in those terms.
Well, thank you, George. I think it's worth, just before I turn to Daniel, and Daniel, your fuller response will be coming shortly, is just turning to David and Nick. Banded tariffs. Now, in a way, I think this is an incredibly innovative idea, and it'd be good to see the Labour Party take it up, just a thought, because it would allow us to genuinely export higher welfare standards as the price of market access, rather than letting essentially cruelty be a competitive advantage. Now, is that how you might see it, David? Or is your take somewhat different from George's?
No, so the RSPCA would agree with George that we need some core standards in there that the UK keep to on animal welfare. Otherwise, you get the problem that we've just had with Australia in particular. Don't forget that that banded tariffs already exist. So the EU offered the Mercosur countries tariff-free access on free-range eggs, but keeping the tariff at 30% for caged eggs. And I think that's a very good model, and I can't see why the UK can't do something similar when it is negotiating with countries like Mexico, Canada, and India, which it is doing at the moment, and they will want to prize open our market in eggs, pigs, and other products.
Thank you very much. Nick, what's your view from the NFU? And it'd be interesting to have your take on the banded tariffs that George is advocating.
Yeah, I'm similar to David, but by and large agree with the approach that George has set out. In fact, I think in the original report, which was linked in the chat, we talked about it in terms of conditional tariffs. I mean, they're sort of the same thing, different ways of describing, but essentially what you're doing is saying, we will give you preferential access to our market over and above what countries that don't have a trade deal will have, but only for those products that meet certain standards and certain requirements. And where they don't, well, they still have access to our market, but they pay the tariff that everyone else pays. And sometimes that tariff will be exclusionary. It'll be too high. So some sort of conditionality around tariffs, I think, is something we've supported for a long time. I mean, it's worth saying that this is something you can do within an FTA, because you are offering an opt-out from the normal tariffs that the MFN tariffs other countries will face. And essentially you can negotiate what you want to within an FTA. And George is right that you need to then work out what the accreditation around that is. And I think that is absolutely, as George said, possible. But there is a job to do to be able to manage, monitor and enforce that. What, of course, the other part of the question that it doesn't address is how you deal with food produced to different standards or lower standards from countries where you don't have an FTA or you're not negotiating an FTA, and that is a different challenge. And we might go on to talk a bit about that. We've talked about introducing core standards that might address some of those, but that is clearly a concern as well. It's not just about trade deals, but it is about imports from all countries.
Thank you so much. When talking about standards, the phrase leveling up occurs to me, but let's leave that. Let's leave that for now as part of a policy that we might be able to bring harmony to the government on. Daniel, what's Labour's take, and what's your own take on what we ought to do? Are banded tariffs the answer, or are they only part of the answer? And what would Labour introduce?
Well, good afternoon, Philip. It's a pleasure to be part of the call. It's also a pleasure to follow George. For 3 years, I was shadowing George in the sense that I was a second-tier minister, and very much enjoyed his brief departure from the front bench when he introduced extraordinarily detailed amendments, which rather at the time led us to believe that George was actually closer to our view than he was able to admit publicly. And of course, subsequently, that is what has transpired. Look, throughout the discussions on this, Labour's had a very simple, clear position, which is we're not prepared to see UK producers undercut with lower standards. Now, that's obviously a very simple statement, but quite a lot follows from that, actually. I speak to you as a member of the Shadow DEFRA team. I'm not part of the trade team. And my observation is going to be really to look at what's actually happened over the last few years, because as I say, my sense is that George put up a good fight in cabinet, but I think he lost. And to me, the answer to many of your questions is not details about WTO rules or all the rest of it. It's actually about power. It really is about power, because from having had quite a few conversations with people over the years, even the definition of how the WTO rules are applied or not comes down to power, because different people apply them differently. People will take out proceedings against others which will be mischievous just because they can. So this is actually really, as I say, about power between countries, but also within governments. And that would be my key overriding point, I suppose. The question is that balance of power within a government. So from the Shadow DEFRA team's point of view, we're very clear that's what we want to achieve. But we understand that there will be trade-offs within negotiations. So it's then going to depend upon who wins that discussion. So I suppose I had to smile slightly at your introductory comments, Philip, because it hasn't gone entirely as you expected. Well, who knew? Some of us rather predicted that might be the case, but we won't go back to that. But what I would say is that taking back control means taking back responsibility. And that, I think, is what we're seeing unwind here, that as a country and as a governing system, if you like, we haven't yet resolved that question of how you then deal with that responsibility of making those difficult trade-offs. We've seen it within the current government. I suspect we'll go on seeing it into the future. There's no easy solution to it, but in the end, it will come down to that balance of power.
Can I just I'm really interested in how you might enact that. And I can see that sort of you in the DEFRA team and Labour's trade team might actually be as one in this. Are we now looking at sort of essentially introducing trade or tariff barriers around how a thing is produced, not just the safety of the thing that is produced? And if that is the case, will you, sorry to repeat the question, will essentially banded tariffs be part of your mechanism for ensuring such?
Look, we know this question of how something is produced is contentious and doesn't exist within the rules, although, and I seem to remember having this very discussion with George when he was a minister, when we were talking about fur imports some years ago. And obviously the department's position is that you couldn't do it. Others argued that you could. I think, as I say, it goes back in the end, not to details about what the rules are. It's who obeys them and who has the power. So banded tariffs, possibly, but I don't think that's the whole answer from our point of view. Our line is quite a simple one. We will not allow British producers to be undercut.
It's very interesting. So let me take that and let's go directly to Nick. And then Nick, got an emerging counter consensus, if you forgive my language, which is that something is deeply wrong with the trade deals we struck with Australia and New Zealand. Could you name what that is? And then could you expand on kind of what it would be to produce the right settlement, both from the perspective of animal welfare, but from British producers, because of course, we now have the new element of food insecurity, which is an additional geopolitical add, if I can put it like that. So we've got Labour in the midst with the right intentions, if I may say it like that. What would you advise would be the policies we might follow to produce something that could really work? And I'm particularly struck, of course, by what George is arguing for, but what else would you add? But begin, if you would, with what's wrong with the Australia trade deal, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think saying, you know, something deeply wrong or broken with them is probably over emphasizing it, because I think George put it absolutely right to begin with when he you know, to sort of summarize what he said. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but essentially they're very old-fashioned trade deals based on really the price of goods. I mean, you know, that is the one thing that they are designed to do, which is to allow cheaper goods to enter the UK market by liberalising, without any thought to any other externalities, like how they might have been produced, what the impact might be, and without even thinking about what the impact might be on domestic producers, which is actually unusual. Most other countries, including countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, consider the impact on domestic producers in their trade deals, and often bring forward complementary domestic policies, adjustment, compensation, etc., to manage that. And we haven't seen any of that. So you know, they were very basic deals, and I've always said that the real problem at their heart was a failure to realise that trade policy and trade deals in particular mean winners and losers. And you listen to the government at the time, they seemed to refuse to accept there could be a single loser from what they're doing, despite the fact you look at their impact assessments for both those deals, and they clearly show that agriculture and semi-processed foods will be impacted negatively by those trade deals. So yeah, they're just old-fashioned deals, and as George said, what we should have as we look forward to newer deals is to account for other policy imperatives, other policy agendas within those, whether that's climate change, animal welfare, and a number of other things that not related to food that you could include. Now, I think there's a whole host. I could go on for a long time, but there's a number of priorities that I would say government should consider how they bring forward as they look to the next run of trade deals that they're negotiating. Firstly, they should be more cognizant of sensitive sectors in the UK economy. You know, you might look at upland sheep producers or livestock producers more generally in the UK, and be much more careful about how those are safeguarded using quotas and the like in trade deals, and not just totally liberalizing those sectors and reducing tariffs completely, which is what's happened. I talked about briefly core standards. I think the government have failed to take this up. I hope maybe it's something the Labour Party might do in their next manifesto, look at how you bring forward core standards. That's to say, identifying those production standards that UK farmers are required to meet, and identifying the ones which are particularly important and which should therefore be subject to import controls generally. The final two things briefly I would say also is a formal process for assessing and monitoring the impact of these trade deals. Doesn't seem to be there, but you know, somebody's going to be wrong and somebody's going to be right in the next few years. Either these trade deals will mean a large amount of imports, some of those produce to lower standards, or they won't. But we don't know, and we won't know unless there's a proper monitoring with a response process built into that. And finally, we need much better trade scrutiny. The Australia deal is going to be shortly free to be ratified by the UK government, and the deal itself was never put to Parliament for a substantive for a vote on a substantive motion. So Parliament was never capable of providing a view on whether it supported or didn't that trade deal. I suspect it would have done, but we don't know. We don't know. And if there was one thing Brexit was about, it was about taking back control, giving Parliament and our MPs a voice, and they have not been given a voice on these important trade deals. That really needs to be sorted out going forward.
Nick, can I just come back to a point you raised earlier? What would be the preferential position for import of foods where we don't have an FTA? Would the notion of core standards essentially speak to that? So you have de facto tariffs?
Yeah, well, no, you wouldn't necessarily have de facto tariffs. You might do. It slightly depends what your tariffs you have with the WTO, what your bound tariffs are. You can't suddenly put tariffs on things beyond what you've already committed at WTO. But you may actually put in import controls or import restrictions directly on those. Now, this is definitely tricky, and it comes to some of the things we've talked about having import controls on the basis of standards, but it is possible under exceptions at WTO to do that on the basis of animal welfare. So where we are very confident that there is a practice that is unacceptable for the UK consumer and UK public, those are the sort of ones where it should be much more straightforward. And it's a process. You look at core standards. I'm not saying you bring in every single animal welfare standard that UK farmers are subject to. You focus on a handful of very, very important ones, very clear ones, very measurable ones, and you look at essentially restricting imports of those products that are produced to standards that we would just simply wouldn't accept of our own producers.
Thank you so much, and that segues very nicely into David's take on this all. David, from the animal welfare perspective, if you wouldn't mind, could you outline what you think is lacking in the trade deals that we've signed recently? And again, similar set of questions. What would you want from a new trade settlement?
Yeah, so thank you, Philip. Thank you for setting this up. And yes, here we are again. We launched the report last year and we were discussing Australia and New Zealand. And as Nick rightly said, that's now in the end game. The procurement bill is in the last final ping pong stages between the Commons and Lords, and we should see ratification in the next couple of months. So that, to an extent, is a bit of a done deal. Although I would focus on what is in Australia and New Zealand. We've talked about some of the lack of core standards and the tariff-free products that are going to come in. But obviously, Australia and New Zealand are limited by geography. So essentially, we're talking about sheep and beef with Australia and New Zealand. But let's look at what is in there. There is an animal welfare chapter in both of those. That animal welfare chapter recognises the sentience of animals, and that animal welfare chapter also recognises that Australia, New Zealand and the UK will cooperate together at the WTO to seek recognition of animal sentience. To directly address the point that Nick has made, we need a discussion about the issue about how you recognise animal welfare standards in trade deals, and that can only happen at the WTO. So I hope that the UK government will take that up and we'll start those discussions. We have a public forum in September, and I'm hoping that they will attend that and make that argument for animal welfare standards. What we don't want to be is in the same position in another 6 months when we're talking about, and don't forget, and Nick briefly touched on this, we have 6 FTAs happening at the moment. CPTPP, the Gulf Council, India, Mexico and Canada, and all of those to differing degrees have more risk than Australia and New Zealand. Now, I don't know, the rumours are that CPTPP may be a done deal in the next month. So we may be going through exactly the same process as we've discussed then. And I would certainly agree with Nick about scrutiny from Parliament. But let's look at Mexico and Canada. But for the RSPCA, that is the more dangerous area because you don't have geography restrictions. We had rumours in the press last week that the UK government was seeking to allow imports of pigs produced in sow stalls and farrowing crates. Sow stalls have been illegal in the UK for 23 years. So are they going to allow pig meat to come into the UK and undercut our British pig farmers, particularly at the moment, who are going through a tough time? Are they going to allow eggs coming in from Canada, which are produced in the Barron battery cage, which has been illegal in the UK since 2012? Those are real issues, and unless, let's face it, the UK does not have a trade strategy, let alone a strategy on how it's going to cope with animal welfare. And unless the UK addresses this issue and agrees that, like Daniel was saying, that we are not going to allow our farmers to be undercut by cheaper imports. And that is essentially what is in the government manifesto. But let's see that actually play out in real action by differential tariffs, or by saying to those countries and being honest with them at the beginning, these are our standards, quite happy to accept your imports produced to those standards, but you will not be allowed to be given preferential tariffs on products or standards below those standards. And finally, people tend to forget, they tend to think that animal welfare is a contentious issue. The UK has been applying animal welfare standards on imports of meat for over nearly 30 years. Because under our slaughter regulations, any meat that is slaughtered abroad has to meet our standards. That was what we were when we were a member of the EU, and we have transferred that across to now when we are a UK. So we already have that. And when we agreed the FTAs with Australia and New Zealand, those stood. So any animal that's slaughtered in Australia and New Zealand has to meet our standards. So we've already got a model, but it just needs political bravery and courage to take that forward. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go back now to George and then Daniel. So forgive me, but let's try to build the architecture for the world that we all clearly want. So George, you've described banded tariffs. I was particularly struck by Nick's point around a formal process for monitoring trade deals and the institutions that we might need to do that, and the fact that we don't want that as a sort of off the democratic platform quango. We need that subject to open parliamentary assessment and debate. And then I think the core argument of the report that we did on UK trade policy and animal welfare is a set of core standards, because a set of core standards would deal with FTAs and with non-FTAs. How would you put together the whole architecture we might need, George? And do you think the Conservative Party is open to that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I absolutely agree with what Nick said around scrutiny. And actually the government, if they could just embrace parliamentary scrutiny, could really use it to their advantage in the negotiation. So when we were negotiating with Japan, for instance, and seeking dairy access, our negotiators were told, we can't give you any dairy access because we have a parliamentary motion that forbids us from doing so. And that gave their negotiators some support in a way. Their parliament, they could point to their parliament and say, well, we would love to give you this access, but we're not allowed to. And the United States play the same game. The European Union play the same game. We've seen a lot of that ourselves in recent years. Oh, we're not allowed to do that. It's against our mandate, and it will be too difficult to change the mandate. So what we actually should try and do, in my view, is get Parliament to approve and endorse a mandate, and then the government can stand by that mandate and stand its ground. But the problem we've had is if negotiators actually know that Crawford Faulkner can largely do what he wants to do, our chief negotiator, and that he'll always go back and get the instructions he needs to retreat at will, well, then our negotiators know that they can always, if you push the UK, it will always retreat because there's nothing there to reinforce and require the negotiators to stand their ground. They just retreat and retreat and retreat. And they can't tell us that they're not able to retreat, because we know that they can do whatever the hell they like. And so actually having a more formal scrutiny role for Parliament would strengthen your ability to stand your ground. But then beyond that, I concluded in the end there are only really two tools in the box. One is banded tariffs, which I think should be the primary one, and the other is, you know, implementing outright bans, such as we have now on hormones in beef, for instance, or the use of washes on poultry. If you put that in your legislation and it's an outright ban on sale, that is the clearest way to implement a base standard. And it would be open to us as the UK to say that we will ban imports from countries that still allow mulesing, for instance. And if you were to do that, Australia would change their law, just as when the US put in place certain requirements on fish imports in relation to national legislation affecting marine mammals, everybody changed their legislation. And so we could, through a combination of banded tariffs and implementing bans on some of the most egregious practices, you could actually be in quite a strong position to change the way people do trade. My final thing is I'm a bit skeptical. David's point about the animal welfare chapter in the Australia trade deal. In my experience of dealing with the Australians and the New Zealanders, whenever you approach this issue of standards and welfare, the first thing they would do is say, well, let's have a working group to have a chat about this and do some joint working on the importance of animal welfare. Because what they really know is it's a way of putting everyone on a treadmill to nowhere that doesn't achieve very much and just gets ground down in the sort of bureaucracy of these sorts of things. So I would always be cautious about banking some talking shop and thinking that's going to cut it. I would always much rather use the soft power that we have, both through conditional tariff access and outright bans on sale of certain production practices, which we're entitled to do. And I think that would be the better way to promote high animal welfare standards abroad.
I think this is fascinating. So thank you, George. So George, if I may, believes there are only two methods to get the outcome that essentially all participants in this discussion want. Banded tariffs and outright bans. I'm a little confused as a non-expert on the status of outright bans, because from what people have said, it is just a function of essentially force locally. I wonder how it stands within the WTO, but I'll come to that later as a question. Daniel, is there anything you would demur from in what George argued, or anything you would like to add as part of your mix as to what you see as necessary?
Well, look, first of all, the elephant in the room is the biggest trade deal of all that matters is with our immediate neighbours, and getting a phytosanitary agreement with them would actually be the biggest gain that we could have. But putting that to one side, you say we all want to get to the same place. You see, I think when you look at the politics of this, why were those first two trade deals done in the way they were done? They were done in that way because the government needed quick trade deals. In particular, Liz Truss at the time wanted to get them done. Now, that's a poor negotiating position. And of course, the UK is in a fairly unique position in having to negotiate all these trade deals quite quickly. It is argued that, and I know there are different views on this, that you're negotiating with wily, long experienced people who've been doing this for many, many years, and that maybe we haven't always had the same level of experience. And this question of parliamentary scrutiny, well, Labour's position was quite clear throughout, which is what you'd expect from the opposition at that time. And I'm sure the Conservatives would have done exactly the same if it had been the other way around. You'd argue for more parliamentary scrutiny. But as George well knows, that cuts both ways. It does give you advantages, but it also can probably make it quite difficult to complete deals. So none of this is simple. I just go back to my basic point that it is actually about power and WTO rules. I mean, we saw, Scottish whiskey traded off against aeroplanes. It's not a rational process. It's a power process. And we're now a small power player as opposed to being part of a big power player. And that's why I suspect we're going to struggle with a lot of this. So you can go into the fine detail of how you might want to do it. But in the end, we are going to be having to negotiate with quite powerful players, and our cards aren't always going to be that strong, I would say. So this is going to be difficult.
Thank you very much. I think it's probably time to open this up a bit more. For those who are online, please do post questions. Even if you're in violent agreement, when I said we all agree, I meant on this panel. I did actually say about that. There are many who don't agree, which would take me to my first question. If you're tweeting, hashtag is trade deals. What do we do and how do we approach those, particularly say within the Conservative Party, who think free trade is the answer to high food prices? That one of the reasons that we have a cost of living crisis and the high rise in food is the working classes are made to pay the penalty of the tariff barriers that vested interests have created. How does one say, because that's not coming from an unidealistic position, how does one respond to that position and make the case within the Conservative Party for something that you've outlined? George, what would your kind of push back against that view, which is very common in the Conservative Party, be?
Yes, it is, but it's based on a misunderstanding of how tariffs work. And so sometimes people look at the headline tariffs on the agricultural commodity and assume that that immediately translates into food prices. And that's just not true, because the value of wheat that goes into a loaf of bread only accounts for about 10% of the total costs of making a loaf of bread. Actually, the biggest cost is putting it on a lorry and driving it to a supermarket. And on many other of those processed foods, the agricultural commodities is a small part of it. And that's why we did this work in great detail in DEFRA. If you did a full Adam Smith style unilateral liberalization, so forget trade deals, can't be bothered to talk to anyone, we're just going to shut down all tariffs. And there are people that argued that we should do that. The impact on consumer prices is less than 2%. Now, we've just seen 10% food inflation. So it would reduce it a bit, but it's pretty marginal. And the reason for that, as I said, is that the cost of the commodities that go into the average shopping basket is actually relatively small. But if the impact on consumers is marginal and largely irrelevant in the scheme of things, oil prices will always be the biggest driver of food costs, and labor not far behind. If it's irrelevant for consumers, the same's not true for producers. And so allowing tariff-free access to beef and lamb from countries like Brazil or the United States or Australia, well, that can have a significant impact on your domestic production and the profitability of it. And on a worst case scenario, the liberalization of beef, for instance, with Australia, could take out about 25% of British beef production. That's a worst case scenario. A more likely one is that it's about a 5% hit, but it's still real. And so you've got this mismatch between the impact on consumers and the impact on producers. And that's why people are wrong to get so upset about tariffs. They actually can be used as an ethical force for good, in particular to promote high animal welfare standards abroad. And removing them really doesn't change food prices.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, and I'll take it to either Nick or David. What is the actual legal status in WTO or trade terms of outright bans on practices that we think culturally are beyond the pale, but obviously are not elsewhere?
So the WTO, it's a bit of a grey area, is the honest answer, Philip. But let's look at some of those bans. So the UK, as I mentioned before, has had a ban on meat coming in that has not been slaughtered to our standard. That's been there for 30 years next year, and it's never been challenged. So people must be happy with that. George mentioned the seal ban, which came into effect when we were a member of the EU. in 2009. That's a ban based on a product and production method that was challenged by Canada and Norway. The EU tweaked their law and now it's allowed. So we already have very good evidence that if you construct your trade measure in a WTO-friendly way, you can allow a trade measure based on process and production methods. It just needs political will and courage.
Nick, anything you'd care to add to that?
No, I mean, David's right. I think the other factor that's needed as well is to demonstrate that something has is important to the public. So in one of the main areas you can look for those exceptions, which is what this would be to normal WTO rules. It's where you can show that the public feels strongly that a certain practice is unconscionable or whatever it might be under so-called public morals exception. So that is something that, as I say, when you're developing your core standards and what are the standards that you should really prioritize, then those ones that the public feel strongly about are the ones to focus on. But they're out there, they exist, and this is it. When you've got that backing, then it's much easier actually at WTO to make those arguments. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. So look, we have one question I'd like to flag. I'll just read it out from Tony Goodger. Does the panel believe that the current food fraud investigation in relation to selling of sliced cooked beef of South American origin being sold as British in a UK supermarket has the potential to damage current and future trade deals, especially in relation to rules of origin? And please, other colleagues on the call, do post your questions. So Nick, I'll turn to you there, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly brings into sharp relief, the concerns about imports. Now, whether this is not specific to a trade deal, and by the sound of it, it's fraud. So it shouldn't really, whether it was in a trade deal or not, it's criminal behaviour by the sound of it. I don't want to put myself liable for anything, but so this is actually something that we need to be making sure the systems are much more robust to prevent. But what I think it does do, and actually you mentioned this earlier, Philip, and I didn't really reply to it when you raised the issue of food security, that look, we as an island will always import some of our food, and actually it would be silly to try and become totally self-sufficient in terms of food. It's clearly a food security needs a robust source of food supply, and that is a diverse one. So imports will always remain important. But at the moment, we're only about 60% self-sufficient in the food we can produce. And this, I think, brings into focus one of the problems with relying on imports too much is the food you produce on your own shores. You can have much more control over the regulations and standards that apply to its production. You can also, it obviously has, in terms of distribution, getting it where you need it, etc., much easier. So domestically produced food has some advantages in terms of food security that imported food does not, and therefore domestically produced food should be the crucial aspect of our food security. As I say, not entirely, but it should be a more important part than the current 60% suggests it is. And these sorts of issues, imported beef being passed off as British just brings into, as I say, relief some of the problems when you've got an over-reliance on imports.
Thank you so much, Nick. I found this event very, very helpful in generating a general kind of capture of what an alternate approach might look like. And from the front line, as it were, of UK food production, we have Jeanette from the British Poultry Council, who very kindly thanks us for the event. Thank you, Jeanette. And she said, I would like to hear from the panelists what measures they think could be taken now to mitigate barriers that poultry producers are currently facing with exporting to the EU, including the rapidly rising costs of domestic production that are now outpacing market returns. Now, why this is interesting is we are seeing, you know, from the famous turnip producer, from other players, people exiting the UK domestic food market precisely because they're not protected at home and they can't export abroad. I just wonder, George and Daniel, very quickly, if we might have your response to Jeanette.
Yeah, well, shall I go first? There's a difference in my view between the experience of the poultry meat industry over the last year or so and that of the egg industry. And that's because the egg industry is a bit more fragmented. So when it comes to poultry meat, particularly chickens, there are 3 very large companies that produce that. And if you're a supermarket, you basically have to have a contract with them. And most of them practice what they call open book contracting, where a company like Two Sisters will say to a supermarket, we're happy to work on a wafer thin margin of say 2%, but we will not go below that and we will not produce at a loss. And so we'll open our books. You can see how the cost of feed has increased. And then we need our 2% margin, so the cost of chicken must automatically increase to protect that. And that's why they've had the confidence with that open book contracting model to be able to continue production. And the supermarkets have just had to suck it up and put up the price of chicken. Now, when it comes to eggs, it's a bit more complex because you have typically slightly smaller producers, some of them still quite large, supplying middlemen, packers, who then negotiate with the supermarkets. And you get this problem in a volatile market where nobody quite trusts one another. So a supermarket buyer thinks, well, they're just trying it on and using all this cost of living stuff as an excuse to get prices up. And so they allow prices to go up a bit, but not by enough. And then sometimes what was happening is those packers in the middle were seeing an opportunity to make a quick buck by not passing that money back down to the farmer. And then farmers said, forget it, I'm not producing. And so we had a shortage of eggs. So it's sometimes a very vertically integrated model, such as we have on poultry in particular, to a lesser extent on pigs, can actually give you some resilience. And the only solution I see in some of these more fragmented sectors is for the government to use the powers under the Agriculture Act to bring forward regulations to require transparency in the marketplace and regulations on the nature of particular contracts. That's the only remedy I can see, and we took that power for that purpose.
Thank you so much. Daniel, before I turn to you, which I will do, I just want to capture another question that Claire Bass has asked. The Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022 will, when commenced, require all government ministers, including Department of Business and Trade, to show how they have given all due regard to the welfare needs of sentient animals when making and implementing policies. The Act doesn't have great judicial power, but how will the Trade Minister be able to convince Parliament and the Court of Public Opinion that this duty has been discharged? Which I think is fascinating. Daniel, then David, your thoughts on this?
Well, it is a very good question indeed, and I sat on the Animal Sentience Bill Committee, and I did raise some of these issues because I don't think it's nearly as clear cut as perhaps people thought by the end of it. Because in the end, I mean, and George will remember this discussion too. The sentience protections under the Amsterdam Treaty were, of course, historically and famously vague and able to be interpreted by different people in different ways. We've now got something which is more precise, but in some ways could arguably, in my view, actually be weaker. So George will almost certainly take a different view on that. But in the end, ministers will have to, as the question says, show they've taken due regard. There will then presumably be a long and I suspect lots of scope for various organisations to challenge, have further discussions and debate about what that means. Which is why I was never convinced it was a particularly strong protection.
Thank you very much. David, core to your central mission, how would you make it, give it some judicial teeth?
So the important thing with the Sentience Act is to get it in place. Parliament passed the Sentience Act nearly a year ago, and one of the there's only it's a very simple piece of legislation. There's only two things that emerge from it. One is to set up a committee, and the other, as Claire has rightly said, is for ministers to show how they've taken that into account when making policy decisions. But the first of those has yet to be done. So here we are, 9 months on, and the committee still hasn't been set up. So it's in the Secretary of State's in-tray, and the RSPCA is urging the Secretary of State to set that up, because before it can be set up, we can't have any understanding of how the UK is going to do that. But I think it's a really interesting piece of legislation. The RSPCA and others obviously supported it. To be honest, it had pretty cross-party support as it went through Parliament, and it could be a really useful measure to see as we go forward.
Yeah, I confess to being quite excited by trade policy. It's a bit odd, but there you go. And I'm very excited by the people we have on the panel and what they've outlined, because what they've outlined is, I think, a counter policy to the New Zealand-Australia approach that I think would command almost universal support. And I think that this is what we at ResPublica would like to help develop with people on this call, and indeed with those viewing it. So do get in touch, because I've heard lots of different parts of the puzzle, and I want to bring this together into an institutional offer. So in the light of that, and we're near the end, and can I thank you all for joining us for such a sort of an instructive conversation. Just a minute on what we should do next. And out of good manners, I'll begin with Nick, then Daniel, then David, and end with George. Nick?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited, Philip, that you're getting excited by trade policy. A number of us have been getting excited about trade policy over the last few years, but which in itself is an important point, because up until the referendum vote, actually trade policy was largely offshored to the EU. And I think one of the problems we've had over the last few years is it's been revealed how unsophisticated and rudimentary the understanding of trade policy is by many of our political masters. I think George put it very well when, you know, he talked about the misunderstanding of what tariffs and liberalization mean for food prices and for domestic producers. I don't think many people, other than George, understood that, and possibly still don't. So it is, I'm afraid, I think, very still unsophisticated, the understanding of trade policy. That's one of the big challenges. I've talked about other issues like better scrutiny, better impact assessments, monitoring, etc. But above all this, I think, is the need for a proper trade strategy, that spells out where the winners and potential losers lie, what the objectives are, how compensation for losers might work, and is realistic about what trade policy means. And therefore, again, as George was saying, you know, deal with the transactional approach that all other countries around the world take to their trade negotiations, and which sadly we have maybe recently it's changed a bit, but up until now haven't taken.
I think it's across the board. What we need is a trade policy. I hear it from economic advisors. What we need is an economic policy. And I think what's interesting, and it's a global point, is all of our governing agendas are at sea. We haven't set the new parameters of the new settlement. Daniel, what should we do next? Or more precisely, what should Labour do next?
Well, Philip, I think you're missing the point. The policy is that there is no policy, and that is the policy. So Labour takes a different view. Now, in some ways, I would say we're in a more straightforward position, because as an opposition, we're not required to go into fine detail. We've got some very simple, basic points we've made, and the rest of the world will have heard them. So when we're negotiating, there are things that we will stick to. Now, that changes the terms of negotiation, but I still come back to my basic point, which in the end, this is a hard-headed power struggle between groups of people who are trying to get advantage for themselves. And we're trying to, quite rightly, protect animal welfare standards, which matter to us. They don't necessarily matter as much to everybody else. And we've got to make a decision where that particular value and benefit for us sits in relation to the other things we want. And that's called politics.
Thank you very much. David, what should we do next?
So parties are busily writing their manifestos at the minute, and I would not be at all surprised if they write in their manifesto, we need to improve animal welfare standards, farm animal welfare standards, but they also then on a couple of pages later, they say we need to do more trade deals. And you can't have both without some give and take. And what the government needs to do is to work out where its red lines are. And like you, Philip, I am a trade geek. I would make no apologies for that. And I am very happy to be described as such. One of the problems with trade deals is they're all done behind closed doors. And so we assume that sitting down with Canada, the UK has said to Canada, we will not accept any of your beef if it's injected with hormones. But they've also said to them, we're quite happy to accept your pork if it's produced in sow stalls. Now, for me, one of those is a red line on an animal welfare standard and an animal health standard, and the other isn't. But I don't have a clear idea as to why the government has made that red line there and not the other place. So for me, more transparency, clearer as to what parties mean when they say we will not allow trade deals to undermine animal welfare standards, because that's what's in the government's manifesto. And clearly, what we're seeing with Australia and New Zealand, in the RSPCA's view, that has happened. And it may well happen with Canada and Mexico. So more honesty, more transparency, and we can get this done. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Finally, George, what should we do next?
I actually think, Philip, it's quite important to try to get a cross-party consensus about the trade policy. Because if you look at the United States, whoever's in power, they largely have a bipartisan approach when it comes to their approach on trade. The same's true of New Zealand. And I got the sense slightly that, well, Daniel's stance could be best described as managing expectations, if I could put it that way, in that he didn't want to commit to what they would do. But the truth is the US trade deal will now happen almost certainly after the next general election. He and his party will be aspiring to be in government then, so some of us will be trying to stop that happening. But if they are in power, they're going to face the same sort of dilemma. How do you do a trade deal with the United States when they have no animal welfare legislation at all, when that's become almost an ideological barrier in a most peculiar way? How do you actually structure a trade deal? And I went around the houses many times. A banded tariff approach, is really the main tool in the box that you've got. I'd actually engaged companies like Cargill and Tyson in the US on this. Some of them have UK operations. They were open to this, and I do think it would be beneficial if all parties adopted that banded tariff approach. And then whether it takes 2 years, 5 years, 10 years to bring off a trade deal with the US, they will know that whoever's in government, the position of the UK remains the same. And my final piece is what the UK also desperately needs to do, and again, this was drafted during my time, but sadly not published, was have its own SPS statement, a statement of British values on sanitary and phytosanitary issues. Because at the moment, we have this constant problem of really being put into a corner where the question is, are you going to do what the Americans say, or are you going to do what the EU says? And the answer should be, we're not going to do either of those things. We're going to have a self-confident British approach on food standards that is both rooted in science, but which also recognises the farm to fork approach and the fact that good farm husbandry is a crucial part of a food safety regime. And that's what we ought to be doing, and we can do it.
Thank you very much. It will probably come as no surprise to any of you that this is the work ResPublica would like to do now. And what I'd like to do is produce a report that outlines the next moves we should take, from making real the provisions in the animal sentience bill, to banded tariffs, to an institution to monitor trade, and making explicit the power of outright bans, because I'm quite struck again by the remarks by George that we only have 2 tools in the box. So we will endeavour to do this work, and we will be in touch with everybody about this. In the meantime, can I thank you all? It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, George, David, and Nick. We look forward to working further with you. as things develop. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.